Hello again, everyone. If you were here for opening ceremonies, you may have noticed I had a slight change of venue. It's mostly for sound. Um, trying to block things off a little bit by being under a loft bed, you know. But my name is Linnea Katz. I am the president of the Furry Writers Guild, and I am here to tell you about writing disabled characters because I've read far too many stories or even just news articles where trying to write people with disabilities is just not done very well. And I have the ultimate way to start this discussion off. So, you may be asking yourself, Linnea, why is it that you are particularly qualified to discuss this subject? Well, I'll tell you. Because most people have a foot, and I don't. So, in case you are wondering, but I'm using this not only as a terrible joke, because you're going to probably hear me make several jokes about only having one foot this entire panel, but also partially because I want to start the discussion with visible disabilities versus disabilities that are not visible. It's pretty obvious if you were to see me rolling up to you in a wheelchair that I probably have some sort of disability. Usually, again, you look down at the missing foot, and that makes it pretty obvious. Not all disabilities are visible. This may be something that you've heard a lot, but this is incredibly true. There are plenty of disabilities that you're not going to be able to see on the surface. Someone who has particular lung problems are probably not wearing their lungs literally on their chest. At least I really hope not, or that might cause them some severe other problems. Now, Lynn, we're writers though. So how does this matter to me in particular? Unless my novel has illustrations, where does this come up? And it's honestly a pretty solid question, but I see a lot of people who have specifically asked me for things like sensitivity reads and things like that. Not seeing the opportunity to write in things that would make non visible disabilities far more visible in a written format. You can have characters comment on this specific person always seems to be out of breath. And as in the previous example, like this person has a very small limp, or why does that person never seem to come out as much with us? Well, she's always exhausted because she has insert something here. But these can be creative character traits that you can add to your characters to honestly create an interesting thing. And I see this comment here working with people with intellectual disabilities, and people don't think they look disabled. It's really junk. And even in general, this gives you an opportunity to write about that kind of a thing. If a character is struggling and no one seems to get why, well, congratulations. You just got to introduce to your audience like this particular character element in your book, as long as you're being careful and of course writing it respectfully, which we will definitely get to here. Um, but these kinds of things can make characters really dynamic, and in general, you basically never know when you're going to be disabled. So this could happen at any time to any person, and you may find at some point you want your character to, like me, lose a limb. Or I see another comment about you don't look autistic, that kind of a thing. It's very annoying. We can write about specific traits if you want to bring those out in characters, and again, it can add some dynamic things to them and make them more than just the basic character you're thinking of. Just make sure you're doing it respectfully, of course, and try not to fall into too many stereotypes. Because even as a wonderful example, we'll just jump right into it. Don't fall into stereotypes. I am a wheelchair user because I'm missing a foot. Most people would expect that I should have a prosthetic leg. I cannot currently use one in the first place, but that automatic assumption starts so many conversations. And from there, I'm in a wheelchair. So that means I can't stand up, right? Like, there's no way someone in a wheelchair can stand and walk. Yes, they can. They're called ambulatory wheelchair users. Sometimes it's just really tiring. And for me in particular, I don't want to sit on. So it is too exhausting to basically manage. So you can have a character that, maybe it's a surprise. They suddenly stand up. But please please don't make this like some shock and awe thing. Like, that's a perfect moment to have the character sarcastically literally look at them and go, wait, seriously, I have two legs. And you just assumed no matter what I couldn't stand. Because I do all the time. Or when I get on a bus, oftentimes when you're on a bus in a wheelchair, they have these very fancy buckling systems to get you in. Almost all the time, I hop out of my chair and just sit in one of the seats. And it just completely shocks people. For whatever reason, they're just like, what? This is impossible. And folks, it's very possible. Like, it's amazing the things people miss because of stereotypes surrounding certain disabilities in general. And it's really important if you're going to try to write about a disability to, of course, do your due diligent research. Hopefully, you're doing that on all of your writing. Even as a seat of the pantser kind of writer myself, I really try hard to research when I have a specific topic to look at. Because even though I'm also disabled, it does not qualify me or make me some expert on other disabled experiences. So research is super important, and I'm going to put that on top of everything else. Let's see here. Going down my list of bullet points. As we're talking about research, I think one of the number one things you should definitely do is get a sensitivity reader. If you're going to write a character with a disability, finding someone who is specifically an expert on that disability, or at least, again, if you really have no choice, hi, I'm right here and I'd be happy to read things, time permitting, to help you out. Because there's going to be things you miss, and there's going to be things you get wrong, even if you do a lot of research. Different people's lives are so vastly different. You may find some incredibly interesting things that you want to learn or to know, or go, oh, wait, you missed. Again, let's just talk about my prosthetic legs for a moment. Prosthetic legs are really, really interesting and wonderful little devices that you put on, but I could literally say something like, oh, you forgot about the silicone liner that has to go in prosthetic legs so that they can stay on your leg. Or you forgot that we often change out socks all the time. Yes, people still wear socks if they're amputees, and we use them to adjust to the size of our legs as we walk during the day. There's going to be all these little details that people are going to miss. And I'm also going to say this probably specifically from an amputee's perspective. There is a subreddit for amputees, and there is a post once a week from a writer going, hi, I'm trying to write a character who is an amputee, and I want to know basically how everything works. People aren't going to mind answering your questions, but please do a little research first. And that's part of like getting a sensitivity reader. It's excellent to have someone to read over your work. If you're having someone basically babysit you through how the entire thing works, though, that's going to get old to a lot of people very, very quickly because it's something that people have to write and work on constantly. And it's absolutely annoying. I've seen it on other subreddits in various places too, and I totally am happy that authors are trying to write diverse casts that have disabilities, but it's not essentially our jobs to fully educate you. Now, if you ask me a very specific question, like, what is a camber on a wheelchair and why would you want one? I saw this word and I just don't know what it means and I couldn't figure it out. I would be incredibly happy to answer you. And let's see the same thing. Ooh, I have a question. What is the best way to find a sensitivity reader? Oh gosh, that's such a perfect question to ask while we're talking about it. That's not always easy. Of course, I'm going to promote the guild in general. If you feel like you need a sensitivity reader for something, asking people around who are also writers in your general field of furry. I don't know if furry is necessarily a full genre on its own, but we're all writing these stories. Asking there is great. I've seen people quite literally just go on Twitter and say, hey, I am seeking a person from insert this community, find some relevant hashtags. If anyone's interested, please get a hold of me. It's it's not always perfect, but sometimes it's going to have to be how it is. There are some websites out there specifically for trying to find certain kinds of sensitivity readers. You would have to do some hunting. You might be able to be lucky if you go on a subreddit. I know I was just trying to denounce this a little bit, but if you said, hey, I am looking specifically for sensitivity readers on this subject, I want to make sure I did it right. And if you're going to go that route, especially consider compensation. It's not necessary to pay everyone. Not everyone's going to I guess the best way to put it is going to want to be paid. Um, now, I'm not saying like everyone's going to be like, work for exposure. Please don't do that. If someone's going to read your full fledged novel, it is probably worth compensating them in some way. But if they're literally like, no, I like you, you're my friend, and I really just want to read this, do that for them. Maybe give them a dedication in the book. Do something like that. Otherwise, I don't know if you need to pay the exact same rates as you would an editor, but you have to understand they're reading your entire story with that editor's eye. So you may want to keep that in mind. If you paid for like professional editing on your story, and you think I need to pay my sensitivity readers, which is wonderful if you can afford that. I mean, absolutely, please compensate people. But that's the kind of cost that would essentially be reasonable. So that's all down to your budget and what you can manage. I have done editing for anthologies for free just because, again, I love to spend my time doing this. This is my biggest hobby, but that's going to be the case for everybody. It's a, it's a very difficult one, but I will see what I can do too to find more resources for sensitivity readers. I can just see right now that would be a marvelous guild resource to design. So thank you for asking that question. I feel lucky. I realize that I tend to be surrounded by people who work with these things. So it helps me out a lot. On to more potential things to consider writing about in characters with disabilities. And again, if anyone ever has any questions, please ask. I've got my eyes on the chat and I'm happily interrupted. But you need to be very careful to not write what we call inspiration porn. And we call it that because a lot of stories with people with disabilities are meant to be inspiring to others. Oh, this person climbed Mount Everest on a prosthetic. This is this amazing achievement. And they're just another person climbing Mount Everest. I mean, yes, it is impressive they did it with a prosthetic leg. Don't get me wrong, of course it is. But these are things that come up constantly. Or this person in the wheelchair was able to finally stand after so many years because medical science. This is written just to make other people feel better, not to make the story go anywhere or not to talk about the person in the story. This is, of course, a little more commonly seen in news stories, but come on. You cannot tell me if you're watching this right now that you haven't seen a movie on a TV screen where someone broke a leg or someone broke their spine or whatever and had to go through that and do the whole thing. Like, it's really a common narrative. So if you're going to put a character like that into your story, it's something that's really best to be avoided. If that's your whole plan for the story, is that it's only inspirational, that this disabled person is doing these things, I really would just recommend writing a different story, which is harsh to try to say, but it's going to just be better, probably not only for your audience who has seen this trope played out a million times before, but for any disabled readers who come up. And I see a good question. Is the difference between X did a cool thing despite their disability and X did a cool thing and they just happen to be disabled? Oh, okay, not quite a question, more of a statement, but yes, that is absolutely, absolutely it. Because you can do amazing things. It's not in spite of disability. It's, I just did this while I'm disabled. I think this is a great way to move into slightly also the kind of language we use, because a lot of people discuss things like being wheelchair bound, and that's awful, awful language. I use a wheelchair because if I was on crutches, then I would probably be, well, bound. I couldn't go out. You can't reasonably go out, low energy. These things are incredibly exhausting. That chair gives me freedom. And it's amazing how little people understand with mobility devices that we don't have them because it's something that hinders us. It's something to help disabled people get around better and do more. And let me see, would disabled include impaired, like hearing impaired or developmentally impaired? That is a great question. And honestly, I would say yes. Different people have different definitions of disability. And some people will tell you straight up that I don't feel like this thing that affects me is a disability, um, which is very, very valid. But these kinds of things, I would say a disability is essentially something that makes it harder for you to function in society in general. Um, that's a very broad thing because there could be so many factors there, but societies end up valuing specific things. Um, Especially for disabled folks, something that we'll notice a lot is, well, if you can't work a normal 9 to 5 job, where is your value? Which is a very dehumanizing thing in general, but that's where society is. So if these things are going to get in the way of, and I'm trying to not accidentally go on a political thing here, but basically, if it's not going to work with capitalism and it's not going to work with everyday life that everyone else goes with, it's kind of a disability at this point in society and the way our lives are. And it's just kind of a fact to face. And to be honest, this can be a wonderful story and plot thing to mention in your stories, because a lot of people also do just hear the word disabled and assume that you're not a hard worker or you can't do this or you can't do that, and that's just not the case. And there's some fantastic stories that can tackle things like this. I wrote a book myself called What Makes a Witch. I have to do my small plug here, but one of the characters I wrote, well, uses a cane because they need it. They just have some ankle problems. They cannot walk decently without it. And it's such a small thing, but it allows you to build this character and work around it and create new stories. At one point in the story, someone purposefully breaks their cane, and that's a pretty evil act. Like it's a way to show this villain just really does not care about other people. And I'm not saying to also leave a disabled person in despair, because that is the essentially opposite of disability porn, like inspiration porn, like the just absolute my life is horrible because of my disability. There is no joy. I can't do anything. Don't do that, please. But sometimes there are ways to look at this that are also super realistic. I have a pretty crummy wheelchair and I have to use it while I wait for a new one, for example. If I was writing a character in a story, well, insurance takes about a month minimum to approve wheelchairs, and then they have to be built. This is a pretty common thing and it's really messed up. So if your chair broke, well, congratulations. You now have a story element of this person trying to wait to get their way around. How do they do? And again, please don't go into the realms of pure on depression, please. But there are there are ways to take them. Also, I'm noticing in the chat that people are discussing some folks that are have particular blindness, and I just because I see that one in particular, and because they're running the next panel, they're one of the people. I really want to recommend Kyle Gold's story in sensory details. It is not safe for work, so fair warning. But I'm also the Furry Writers Guild president, so I'm going to tell you, please check that out in the Dealer's Den. That's being sold through Thurston Howe Press, because that story is phenomenal disability representation, an amazing example, and shows how experiencing a convention would be like if you were blind. And just because I see that one that kind of topic coming up in particular in the chat a little bit, I had to take the side. But okay, let's see here. Going on to that, other things we can do. We've talked about inspiration porn. We've also talked about avoiding essentially desperation porn and depression. I think a great jumping off point, especially from the latter, is discussing how disability affects people. Because I am not going to lie to you and tell you that everyone with a disability is perfectly happy that they're disabled and don't want to, and would be like, nah, if I had the opportunity to click the switch, I'd just stay how I am. Because, as previously mentioned, society makes that quite difficult. So, essentially, it's, of course, not. But if you're assuming that everyone who has a disability is very suicidal or something else, you are definitely have the wrong picture, because it's just not the case. Plenty of people are perfectly okay with their disability. Their houses are wonderfully adapted. They're incredibly comfortable. You have your loved ones. You have everything else in this world. It's not the disability that's the problem. It is almost always outside society. For anyone who's maybe watching this who doesn't live in America, we have the American with Disabilities Act, which should basically mean, businesses have things like ramps, disability parking is proper. But I can tell you if I just go outside the block right now that most of the time there are not ramps near disability parking during in the small little mall area that's literally right next to my apartment complex. That's my disability is not what makes it a problem. It's society not adapting and doing things to reasonably help with that. And if you're going to write these characters, this can be very, very helpful in trying to design that essentially and trying to design where the conflict comes potentially to them in a story and how other people perceive you and things like that, because that's going to be a problem. Let's say, for example, I just want to go out for a fun night with my friends. There's going to be this moment of, oh crud, can we take them? Can the chair fit in the car? Is the place we're even going to? Can you get around? Before the pandemic started, there was a barcade I used to love to go to, and that was the biggest thing. Everyone's like, I don't know if you're going to be able to fit in between the aisles of stuff and be able to get around. And it's such a dumb thing, but again, it's more outside forces that affect. Or perhaps your character has a romantic angle going on. Let's be honest, unfortunately, a lot of people see folks with disabilities as, I guess the best way to put it is sexless, or they wouldn't be interested in romance for whatever reason, which is why. Um, absolutely don't understand that, but it's definitely a thing. So if you're looking to write this again, going into full desperation mode, not a great idea. Going into this realistically and being able to be like, my character's having dating problems and it really isn't their fault. It's something outside of this, and that is why they're sad and having this discussion. That kind of flavor is not just going to make your story better, but it's going to help things be a lot more accurate. And also, while I my panel is mostly safe for work, there are entire books out there on how to manage things with sex and disability that are marvelous. So if you are looking to write a story about if you're looking to write a story that is potentially going to hit into not safe for work categories, um, that is a huge possibility for you. I would personally recommend a book called A Quick and Easy Guide to Sex and Disability. Wonderful. It's basically in comic form. 10 out of 10 book. Absolutely wonderful. But it's definitely one of those things that people are also very afraid to broach and discuss too, which is understandable. But believe me, a lot of things that you take for granted in general society or anything else come from the disabled community, which is another, I suppose, small topic worth discussing. Things like mobility devices and everything like that. How do you write them? I'm not going to say go out and find a wheelchair and start wheeling around in it. Although, honestly, if you're going to write a character in a wheelchair and you can do that, like, do it. Like, give it a try. Ooh, I see a comment about Toph. Yes, I think Toph is excellent on that point. But disability accommodations are a part of your everyday life, and you don't even know it. In terms of on the sex side again, a little bit. Um, if you've ever heard of a sex swing, guess what, folks? That was designed because it's the same thing as a lift that disabled people use to get in and out of bed who can't do it themselves. You use it every day. As seen on TV stuff, a lot of those products are designed for people with disabilities, and those wonky commercials we all laugh at, that's actually the kind of thing people are struggling with, and they're just trying to market it to more of you to make more money. So there are a lot of adaptive devices out there. So when you design a character, think about it. Does my character, especially because we're furries, is their paws tremor really badly? Well, maybe they're going to need these specific things in their life. And these are the little tidbits that you can drop here and there in the story to really make it immersive and true. And let's see here too. I see another question. I have not covered writing deaf or nonverbal characters yet. I absolutely wanted to though, because it is a phenomenal topic. So why don't I just jump into it? Because why not? It's one of my bullet points that I have written down here. Writing deaf and mute characters. This one is going to be somewhat controversial, and this comes not because I'm trying to say something controversial. This comes from the deaf community themselves. For one, remember that I mentioned earlier that not everyone hates their disability, and outside society is more of the problem. You should Absolutely. If you're going to write about the deaf community, study it a little bit first. The deaf community is incredibly vibrant and has everything from accents on the different kinds of signs that people use to entirely different language. Of course, like American Sign Language is different from European Standard Sign Language and things like that. But so you have a lot to learn there, but especially in the era of cochlear implants and things like that, not everyone has a problem with being deaf. They don't. It's more society isn't adapted to them being deaf, which causes problems. So definitely make sure that you are, for one, not just instantly assuming that your character that you're writing has a problem with their hearing, but two, um, make sure, especially as we have paws and everything else in the furry world, you would probably need to talk about a paw. Like, it's not going to be like a hand sign. They're going to be signing with their paw. Or it may have a totally different name because of that. And ooh, right, someone speaking in sign language. That is actually wonderful because I was about to talk about this. But that is the controversial bit. After you have studied how signing works and you even potentially realize there's accents. So guess what, folks? There's things like Southern accents or there's like Black Sign Language. These are things that exist and you should look into. But normally we write, this character said. I mean, of course, a lot of us use fancier things, but that's the basic, right? Linnea said, blah, blah, blah. We write that on the paper. That's not probably going to fly. A lot of people will say that you should just write the word simply like you normally would, and then have some sort of reference to signing. So, example, Linnea signed "I love you" as an example, because you want to make sure that people actively know that this is being signed, that they're using their hands. There are other people who say that you shouldn't write it traditionally and you shouldn't use quotes basically around the words, like, because that means someone is speaking and this person is not speaking. And in that case, you could use something like italics. And this is honestly controversial even amongst people writing deaf characters and in the deaf community. Um, I'm going to tell you right now a couple things you don't do. One, the grammar for sign language is very different than our grammar. Words go in different orders, and if you try to write it like specifically just like that, it's going to make you may be being really, really accurate, but gonna make you look like you're insulting your kid. This is not the exact grammar. I am not a perfect expert on sign, but something along the lines of "car go to the store." Like that could be a somewhat of a sentence structure that is possible under sign language because of how sign language works. They're obviously saying, let's get in the car, we're going to the store. But if you write it in that other way, it's going to come off as really insulting, even again, if it's accurate. So I recommend not doing that. I also recommend not writing in all caps because there have been a couple books that have done this instead of like instead of actually doing something like that, they write in all caps without quotes. Also not great. Again, usually quotes or italics seem to be the way that most people prefer, but it's iffy. There's no consensus, unfortunately, on this one that I have ever been able to find. Uh, but I also do not recommend. There are fonts out there with letters, like you can see the people's hands for all of the different letter signs and it matches the fonts on your keyboard. Please don't do that. Not only is it just not gonna be easy for somebody to read, but again, it's kind of patronizing. uh, but it's a tough one. I mean, myself personally, I think this is just literally this is how I would love to see it. I think again, italics is the way to go on that one because I agree with quotes. It implies speech, and someone may not be speaking. However, your character may also, even though some people are essentially what we qualify as mute, they can still speak somewhat, or they can still, if they're deaf, hear somewhat, because hearing loss and all these other things are on a complete spectrum like anything else. So keep it in mind with your characters. They may actually be somewhat speaking. You may be able to be like they're saying these kinds of words that are jumbled, but it's very obvious that they're signing this, and it may be worth that as a character. Maybe your character gets really excited, so they start talking, or they vocalize, or do anything else while they're signing. It is something that is super normal and totally happens, so keep an eye out. We're going to jump right into the next question. Do you have any tips on writing characters who are deaf or mute interacting with characters who aren't and are unable to effectively communicate? Um, I'll start in general with writing mute characters. I think it can be a similar thing as signing. Some people like to just write if they are mute and have those problems. Some people also do have selective mutism where they just cannot speak during certain moments and they're overly stressed and things like that, and they have other ways to communicate. Um, it is entirely possible, and I know it's very easy to have a story where person meets someone who is mute, or even at a minimum, person meets someone who speaks a language they do not understand. So how do you tackle this frustration? I mean, it's very easy to write again that person being frustrated because it makes sense. Honestly, the frustration on both sides. If you want to talk to someone and they can't understand you, that's a tough one. Um, it's it's difficult in general. Again, the best advice I can give you is don't accidentally become patronizing about it. There are definitely ways to figure out how to communicate with someone, and it probably depends on, at least in the case of being mute, how did they become mute? Do they have the ability to sign? Are they mentally impaired in some way so that that's why they are mute? So it may be more difficult for them to do essentially the like point at this is a rock, or do charades, or do something like that. Is that something they can't do in that situation? Um, for characters who are deaf and have a difficulty communicating, that is also excellent. There are some deaf mute authors on Twitter that you can follow who can probably tell you a lot more about this. I'll see if I can grab resources like that. But it's a very difficult thing because not being able to communicate is, again, highly frustrating. You want to make sure you don't get into the point of, again, like desperation porn almost. But it's very reasonable for someone to be upset, for someone to have difficulties, for that frustration to just kind of like come out. Because if you're in a room with somebody or trying to talk to them and they just absolutely couldn't respond to you, how would you feel? It's not going to be that much different for someone who's disabled. It's going to be pretty similar. Maybe slightly more frustrating in general. Um, I'm also seeing some other questions. So it would be better to write it as typical grammar. Yes, if you're going to write signing or any of this other stuff, my advice is write it as typical grammar. Again, it's not quote unquote accurate, but please do it, because if you do it any other way, it's probably again going to come off as patronizing or like you're insulting someone's intelligence, even if that's not the intent. Let's see here. If you're interested in learning ASL, there are free resources online. There is I would have to look up their specific name. There is a furry that does small videos on Twitter discussing different signs and sign language, actually, in fursuit. So if that's something you're really interested in, there's tons of stuff. And there are some wonderful books out there too that are very inexpensive, like in the $10 range, that can teach you basic sign language. It's like any other language, you know, do that kind of thing. And oh, this is so wonderful. This is a topic I really wanted to talk about. How do you think anthropomorphism can affect a portrayal of someone with a disability? This is wonderful in so many ways because we talked about adaptive devices and things people don't think about. My persona, and personally, uses a wheelchair just like I do. And people don't realize there is usually, especially in the typical tank wheelchair you find in a hospital, a small gap between the back of the chair and the seat you sit on. That's where your tail goes, people. It's very easy to have that gap be a normal thing in your society, as an example. If you have digitigrade legs, a prosthetic would need to work differently, or else you would end up falling. You could not make it in a typical way. Even especially in terms of prosthetics, we use these silicone liners to help keep it suctioned to the skin. It's kind of an important thing. Fur is going to be a lot more slick. So you're going to have to come up with a way for the leg basically not to fall. And there are methods to do that. There, in Australia, they have things now where you can directly implant clips into the bone, which scares the heck out of me. I wouldn't do it personally, but these things could exist and might be mainstream in your furry world if that's all they can do. If your characters have far more realistic paws and they're not as much like hands, if they need to use crutches, then what? Or if your characters are on all fours, you're probably looking at a wheelchair like you would for your pets. And you can see too, if you want examples, there are lots of animals out there. There's a particularly famous Twitter cat that does not have front legs. How do they interact with the world? Like, you can go see for a large portion of things how some of these characters would interact. There's also some very specific animal things that you could probably bring on. Um, like fainting goats. That's something you could write into your story. Maybe that is a real thing your character suffers from. Or I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head, but some cats and other animals can have essentially an illness that makes it so they just do not have any sort of balance. They completely flop all over the place. And that's something you could actually write. Different animals have different kinds of disabilities. Or even as an example, in our world, albino tigers tend to have health deficiencies and issues. So if you wanted to go, okay, what's an easy disabled character for me to write right off the bat? Is there a species that works best for this? I'm going to tell you an albino tiger or an albino like is probably your way to go. And there's lots of different animals that actually have these very specific things that you can look into, illnesses or things that particularly affect them. And that can definitely affect the world. I noticed that someone else also asked things like, are there nuances to writing sign language with animals who have claws, hooves, etc., instead of hands? Of course. I mean, even from the simply like they signed with their hooves as a sentence, maybe their language is different. Maybe if you have hooves that can click together, some of that is part of the language. Like, again, someone may not be able to hear things, but vibrations and everything else can very certainly exist. Maybe that's a way that's part of their communicating, or maybe the species just doesn't speak in general and but can still hear. So the clicks, that is a part of their language. Um, if you're looking at signing too, if someone actually has a very realistic bird claw, it's going to limit the amount of things that they can physically do, right? So you're going to have to consider how that language works. It may have to be more strictly alphabetical instead of having lots of different signs for everything. It may have very different things. Like a bird that speaks sign language and has claws might have flying or even how their wings move as part of the language, which is wonderful and amazing. Yeah, but it creates these really amazing doors that can be opened up, and you just have to consider essentially what part they have. It's just like if you had hooves, how are you going to use a keyboard? How are you going to use a mouse? Because we have hands, and this is a very easy motion to make. But if you have something like this, how do you use it? So you just have to essentially consider how that affects things and see how it would work. Let's see here. How about approaching disabilities from a specific species point of view? Absolutely mentioned this. A flightless bird would absolutely work, or a bird that has been had its wings clipped would absolutely work, or broke a wing or anything else. If society is used to them flying, how do they adapt? And I feel like you could come up with wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things. Um, Maybe this world has adaptive, essentially, crutches to help people with wings. Maybe you just go watch How to Train Your Dragon. But I mean, seriously though, maybe you just go watch How to Train Your Dragon and see that you could create these devices and how this would work. And it's really, really wonderful. And I noticed someone else said this too, and that is absolutely wonderful. Unless you want it to be all about signing or these other things, it is correct. You don't want this to be the only focus of your story. But a lot of times, these small details can be things that just drip into your story, or can be very subtle things. It doesn't even have to be big. If I was going to write a character with an amputation like I have, I could just be like, what they put on their clothes and then they got on their leg, or they literally, I could just be like, and they put on their leg and they went out. I don't have to make it a big detail. This can just be a random character thing and not be the focus. And please feel free to do that. If it needs to be the focus in a situation, like, my prosthetic leg got stuck in the mud and it popped off and now I can't walk, I mean, free. But, and someone else is mentioning too, which is wonderful. Otters in Space by Mary Loud. Yes, there is swimmer sign, and that is a way they can communicate underwater, or even for octopus or octopi. My apologies. They have multiple limbs. How do they communicate? How does their sign language work? It is really wonderful. I would like to hear your thoughts about curing a disability in a story, particularly in a setting with magic. That is marvelous. It's going to somewhat depend on your magic, for one. As we mentioned earlier, there's going to be some people who don't want to have their disability essentially cured. It's not a big deal to them. This is part of their life. A lot of people who are neurodivergent would definitely say that a lot of the time. Or again, if you were deaf and a part of a very big deaf community, suddenly being able to hear might not be great. That may even be worth considering. The sudden ability to hear or have these problems might not be some miraculous thing it looks like. It may be actually pretty traumatizing. I think um I think too it's again, we have to make sure that we don't hit into desperation like categories and depression, but there's going to be some things where people are going to want to cure. Um for sure. Absolutely understand. And it's going to definitely be finding that fine line between what can your magic actually reasonably do. Can you just make me a magic leg to walk on, or can you grow my leg back? Is that a painful process? Maybe I would say no to it because I'm told that's the worst pain you can go through, so I'm going to pass. It's going to be super dependent on your world, but you just think about, I guess, your character's motivations on, is this something that they absolutely really want to fix? Is this something that if it wasn't fixed, it could make their character even stronger? Um, I mean, you look at Game of Thrones and Jamie having to use his arm like that. Is that going to make him a stronger character and give him character development? I would only say yes. So, but if magic can cure it, I mean, we have stories where magic can bring people back from the dead. And if in your world it's very normal to just not have people have these problems because of magic, then it's pretty normal in your world. Disabilities are, again, what society isn't used to dealing with or doesn't deem valuable or causes problems. So just think over your world and tackle it that way. And if you are particularly interested, there is an episode of Star Trek. I'm gonna have to remember its name. I will think on that, but there's an episode of Star Trek that covers this incredibly well. What is it? Uh, well, I try to think about this. There is a the Masterpiece Society. There we go. It's it's Star Trek: The Next Generation. The Masterpiece Society discusses too why even in worlds where, in case of Star Trek, essentially science is so strong it is almost magic, why some people would still have a disability and why it might not be a bad thing for that disability to exist. It is my favorite example. And I see here on depression, what if that disability, it can be very debilitating, why the hate on depression. For in general, super fair. Depression is awful and writing it realistically is also very difficult. If your character is truly struggling with depression, I think my rules on please don't go into desperation porn territory are probably out the window. Like, figure out, of course, again, why you're writing this character and write them with empathy and don't fall into too many stereotypes. But sometimes characters are going to be depressed. And it is okay to have a character who is miserable because something in their life is really miserable. I think Greg Luderman does a fantastic job of this in one of his stories. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but one of the characters ends up with a pretty severe disability that affects them in terms of their species. They not only look a little different, which is whatever, but they lose their sense of smell, which to their species in this story is incredibly huge. It's like one of the most important things in terms of touch and connecting with somebody. This is going to lead to depression, and that is okay. It is okay for a character to actually be that depressed and want to try to fix this or do anything else. Um, do not be afraid of writing that story, and do not be afraid of tackling depression. Just again, do it as best as you can with empathy, and try to not, like try to not make it too horrible. There's not a really a great word for it, but you don't want to make it so that it's just a big blatant full of stereotypes. And I know that stereotypes sometimes come from a place of truth, but like but again, like it's just like me. If I have a wheelchair, it doesn't mean I can't stand up. Like, make sure that if you're writing depression, you understand the specific symptoms your character is having. And I noticed that someone is asking a piggyback question on anxiety, a very similar thing. If this character is anxious, how does their anxiety present? How does it work? And you look at that, and that's how you write the character. Make sure that they're not just, twitching and looking around every corner and always looking over their shoulder, because that's apparently what anxiety is. Make sure that it suits your character and that it fits things. Like, that it actually fits what you're trying to write. Um, let's see. I see someone else mentioning something about blue-eyed cats often being nearsighted. there are a lot of things like that that do exist. And I know I mentioned that earlier. Another person's mentioning who we had a cat whose land on feet was broken. So if you did drop them, they'd twist to land on their side. That is really common. And even in the adult world, if you have a severe disability like mine, or you have this tattoo that says fall risk, you fall down a lot. You could be taught literally by your physical therapist how to fall. And it's something worth considering, which is really, really interesting. And let's see here. Someone else is mentioning a story where an alien like whistled instead of speech. Yes. When we talk about mutism, like being mute or anything else, um, that's it's a similar thing. There could just be other forms of speech you should consider. And I see here too. How do you feel about neurotypical people portraying someone on the autism spectrum? That is difficult. Um, it's a it is a really, really tough one because I want more stories told by, we call it own voices, but I want that to be a thing that exists. And within the furry community, I feel like we're lucky because we do have some publishers who are really brave and putting that content out there and really specifically want people telling these stories. Because unfortunately, it's harder to get those stories published otherwise, and it's really, really dumb that it is, but it's a thing. If you're going to try to tackle something like this, especially again things like disability or neurodivergence, or even I mean, this is obviously not a disability, but LGBTQ topics, if you are not in this group, you had better get sensitivity readers who are, because you are going to get things wrong. I guarantee it. No matter how hard you research, you're going to get something wrong. You're going to miss really vital and important things. I'm not going to say totally don't write it or don't have the courage. If you really have this character and you're like, I really want to represent this and I'm going to do it right, go do it right. But you're going to need to be really careful, because even if it's not intentional, if you write a story or a book that gets really big and you're messing up like people's interpretations of this disability because they read your story and now they assume this is what all these folks are like, you can cause literal real world damage to people by not writing it accurately. So just consider that when you're going to write that story. I see here too, should a disability in your fiction be related to a real cause? A person born unable to speak, should the cause of this be related to a real world cause? Or can you come up with unique causes? You could definitely do both. Maybe in your sci-fi story, I don't know, shrug, some sort of space thing exists. Or maybe in your magic story, there is a curse upon this particular section of the land, and all people born there are unable to speak until the curse is lifted. Or there's a lot of different ways you could go with it. I would say really on this one, it's again, as long as you're tackling it with empathy and it suits your story, that's probably where you're right to be. um uh and I noticed someone else has a comment too. Even if you are in the right community, you might want alpha readers on it. It's also a really fair point. Because again, I can talk about certain things with my disability and wheelchair use, but just because I use a wheelchair doesn't mean I could tell you about an electric wheelchair by any means. I've never used one. Or there may be things I am totally, completely missing. And I want to make sure, too, that anyone watching this panel understands that I can't speak some gospel truth. Just because I have a disability, I mean, I'm missing this leg, I've got some nerve damage, but just because I have this doesn't mean I know about everything. I try to stay connected in the disability community as an advocate, but please by no means think that I am the ultimate truth on how this all goes. The basic general advice I can give is always, get beta readers. Please don't write inspiration porn. I don't really know of any disabled person I have ever met that actually likes inspiration porn and its cousin, desperation porn. Neither of them are good. Please don't write those. But those are about the best in terms of advice I can give that is completely general, because different people are going to feel like different things. And if you can do your research and your homework properly, you can probably get a good idea again to at least start your story, but you're going to mess some things up along the way. And it's definitely worth it. And oh my gosh, another thank you again, Tan, for this comment as well. If you do mess up, do not blame your sensitivity readers. Because, yeah, and they're absolutely right. They mentioned this too. Some people have stopped sensitivity reading because they basically get yelled at or called like, "Ah, you're obviously too sensitive." It's like, no, that's not the case. If they're commenting about this to you, definitely, they're definitely doing it for a reason. And I would also highly recommend for your sensitivity readers, especially for disability topics and stuff too. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories lead into similar traumas. Maybe somebody got in a car accident, or and now they're disabled, or things like that. Again, these are really big tropes, and I suggest avoiding them if you can. But some stories, this is going to happen, and it's going to make sense. Make sure that you're giving out content warnings to your sensitivity readers. I really suggest books have content warnings no matter what these days, honestly, because some people really could use them, and it should probably become a publishing standard. But especially for your sensitivity readers, like really, really, really be kind to them. And gosh, that is probably a wonderful comment there in the chat room too. It all comes down to empathy. I think if I really could probably summarize this panel, that might be it. I said it over and over again. Make sure you're writing this character or this disability with empathy for the person who is suffering or not suffering or whatever else. Because again, that's where the empathy comes in. I don't think I suffer from my disability. It's a pain in my butt sometimes, but I live a pretty happy life. Other people may be having a far harder problem. So when you're trying to tackle these things, just come at it from a place of actual caring, sincerely wanting to do a good job, and you're probably going to manage as long as you, again, do your research and get some sensitivity. I see the 5-minute warning. Thank you, Nanakiri. If we have any last-minute questions, I am down to field them. Let's see here. Say you publish your book and it hits the shelves, and you find out you've messed up in a way that nobody caught. Oh, how to handle this as an author. This is actually really great because, to be honest, most authors say, I don't give a crap. Not the way to go. You probably have one of two options. One, you can completely ignore it in every way and never comment on it whatsoever and just hope that people stop talking about it. That's a really crappy way to go about it. And to be honest, it happens. And I really wish it didn't, but it happens. If you make that mistake, the first thing I think you should do, like with any apology, is make sure that people know that you actually do mean you're sorry. I tell I have a very small daughter, she's 7, and what I tell her is, you can say sorry all you want, but you have to take actions to prove that you're actually sorry. And I think that's it. Like, you can say, we had sensitivity readers, we did all this and we missed it, but you need to take that hard line. For the future, we are going to have X amount of sensitivity readers and put this out in certain places here, or do something like that is a way to tackle it. Like, make sure people actually actively can see, this is a mistake I made, and I'm making sure it does not happen again. I think that's the best way to tackle it. And yes, a faux apology is worse than none. Because I'm sorry, we obviously did everything right, but we missed something. Even though it's true, that's more trying to justify the mistake that was made instead of trying to look at the future and how we're not going to make it again. So, yeah. If you need to make that apology because mistakes happen, the best way to do it to me is to show actively that you are trying to fix the problem, and do everything you can, of course, to make sure. But to say this about wraps up time here, and I at least wanted a minute or so to say I'm Linnea Caps. You can find me on Twitter at Literal Grill. Yes, a literal grill. That's what you're thinking. And my website is linneacaps.com. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm president of the guild, and if I wake up to like a million DMs from people asking me questions, I'm usually pretty excited. As long as they're good questions. Please don't give me any. Please don't tell me everything's burning down. But I am always happy to answer questions. This is only an hour, so I know there's probably more out there. So please feel free to ask, and I will get back to you as soon as I can with the convention. Thank y'all so much. I hope you enjoy some awesome Cassidy Civet music, and if you want to a little bit, If Kyle has time during his next panel, ask him about his really good story in sensory. But for now, I'm gonna pop out of here.